Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this final event in the Angel webinar series. So this series started in November 2022. In this academic year, we have 5 events, roughly one every 2 months. We started with a webinar on cooperation, development, and global citizenship education. Then we have 3 more events organized by the special interest group on teacher education. And the one, I remember the last one was the New Voices in Global Education and Learning, organized by the Early Career Researchers group. So we have a very intense and very rich agenda. This is the final event. Today, we are particularly happy to host an outstanding scholar, Susan Robertson. I'm very grateful to her for accepting this invitation. Susan will discuss how the role of 2 major international organizations involved in education, especially UNESCO and OECD, has changed over the year in governing especially the education future. Because the futures, plural, of education is a key dimension for education in general, but especially for this particular community, the community of global education and learning, for global citizenship education, is a crucial dimension because this approach, global citizenship education, is a transformative education approach. And being a transformative approach, it requires a hopeful, imaginative ethos always oriented toward the future. So the future is a crucial dimension for both education and especially for a global perspective in education. This webinar is based, as you probably know, on a recent groundbreaking article by Susan Robertson, which I strongly recommend reading. And in the chat, you will find probably the full reference of this article. This article is included in a special issue of the journal Global Society, edited by Berten and Crank. The whole special issues is interesting, but I think that this article is particularly suitable and important for the education community, education research community. Susan is well known. I don't think she needs any introduction. Just briefly, let me remind you that she's professor of sociology at the University of Cambridge. She's also distinguished professor at Aarhus University in Denmark, and she has written extensively on globalization and its impact on education policy in particular. She's also founding director. I'd like to remind you that is a founding director and currently co-editor-in-chief of the journal Globalization, Societies and Education. This journal is one of the key journals for our community. So we all know this journal because in our field is one of the most important milestones. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I can't think of a better audience to present this work to. And in fact, actually looking at the first screen and thinking about the Gini connections and so on, and it reminded me of the first network that the European Commission funded in 2002 to 2004, where we were fighting the Commission to do intellectual work around globalization, Europeanization, and mobility and so on. But you've established it. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity, and to all of you who've made time to come and listen. And I can see some familiar names and faces and new ones. So, okay, so let me share the screen. And what I'm also going to do in my presentation is I'm going to make some remarks about the kind of theoretical orientation. Massimiliano is absolutely correct, and I didn't even say thank you to both Kester and to Massimiliano to helping set this up. So again, thank you to both of you in making this possible. But you're absolutely right. The education is almost by definition about making futures. They're future citizens, education policy work for example, is always given over to some form of anticipation around future making. So the structure of what I'm going to present is I'm going to make some remarks on anticipation and the future. The special issue, the opening piece by Matt Crank and John Burton, is particularly useful, though you'll also see I'm departing a little bit from some of their framing, but it was a great honour to work with them and to get for them to really push me to begin to think about how education itself engages in future making work. So let me just move to the second slide, essentially, really. And I'm focusing specifically on international organisations. For some of you who know my work, I'm interested in national governments and what happens in national contexts, but I'm also, as a scholar of globalisation, particularly interested in those organisations like the World Bank, the philanthropic organisations, for example, the Gates Foundation. And in this specific case, I was interested in thinking about future making from the international organisations. And in the end, I chose to just work with two international organisations. Partly they've got slightly similar kind of parallel histories in terms of their timing of their formation. So UNESCO, which was formed in 1946, just after the Second World War, and it emerges taking a very specific kind of shape. And I'm going to contrast this with the OECD. And I think when I first started working on this paper, I thought that I would simply just do a comparison between these two organisations in the contemporary moment. And it was partly stimulated by a report that the UNESCO had put out, which many of you, I'm sure, actually know, which is the International Commission on the Futures of Education. And it released its report in 2021, and I was intrigued with how they set that report up, because it was quite similar to the way in which they had set up two very significant prior reports, the FOR report in the 1970s and then the Delors report in 1996. But UNESCO is interesting because for the moment too, there's a little bit of a struggle going on between the two of them, between who's actually going to both frame and roll out the 4.7 global citizenship, which again speaks very much to your network's agenda. But I found myself going backward in time, more or less like a good historical sociologist does, to actually look at their kind of formation. And what the paper does is it takes you through kind of three moments really of crisis. So in each case, what's happening is a recalibration, I might say, of how the organisations both function, their relationships to each other, and specifically how they mobilise particular technologies of governing. So it takes me really to the first point, which is to say that international organisations anyway face challenges in terms of global governance. And that's something your network will be acutely aware of. All global processes, when it involves, let's say, not nation state spaces or institutions, but actually forms of legitimation kind of, or sovereignty being kind of ceded upward, then essentially what you begin to see is that they are governing, but in the absence of formal regulatory mechanisms. We've got the human rights, Declaration of Human Rights that might draw certain countries in, the rights of the child and so on. But fundamentally, they're governing in the absence of sovereignty. So So the first point then is essentially how do they govern deep inside a nation state space, which is where education is largely kind of constituted, governed, and so on. How do they claim forms of authority? So this is the point of Mundy and Zern here, where normative governing is now dependent upon legitimacy. And we'll see as we get to the third phase of it. And I'll begin to talk about Jens Becker's work on promising legitimacy. So when a future arrives and it's not the future that they promised, and there's some interesting work that's going on currently around those kinds of ideas. But these anticipatory devices, and we could name some of them right now, scenarios, indicators, we can look at the way in which the OECD most recently has rolled out this kind of global compass. These are all devices, anticipatory devices, that try and realise a particular kind of future. So in a sense, the future and governing the future is fundamentally what's at stake and what is at play. Some writers talk about colonising the future, and this would be in the tradition of Helga Nowotny, who's written quite a bit in this kind of area. So what we can say about the future is that by definition, it's unknown. Okay, which doesn't mean to say that, in fact, actually, there's not an effort to try and imagine a future. And Jens Becker's work on imagined futures is really important here. But it's not the only work. We can see work by the recently deceased Eric Olin Wright thinking about real utopias. So utopia kind of work is also attempting to realise a particular kind of future, kind of prefigure the future. So I'm interested then in the techniques and the instruments that each of these different organisations are deploying to try and deliver what we might describe as a future present. So a future that now arrives as a present. And then how, when those presents arrived, how do we actually seek to manage those when they arrive in ways in which they're somewhat unexpected? So let me just go on. So here what I'm reflecting on, and it's developed in the paper, is the way in which different societies and different cultures, different civilizations have different kinds of relationships to the future. And often there's work that's done that identifies Bourdieu's Kabyle society, where the present and the future are pretty much the same kind of thing. And this is pretty much those cultures where the seasons and the repetition of the seasons begins to delineate a fairly common kind of patterning. So the future and the present are pretty much the same kind of thing. And I just give you one example here, which it would be probably an archetypal example, but it would have been in some of the Polynesian islands, where if you think about how we teach, prediction and in science and hypothesis, things that might prediction and hypotheses about what might emerge as a possibility. And the general view is in those kinds of societies, this kind of prediction that's taking place, time future in some way, is actually somewhat difficult culturally, because actually the present and the future are the same kind of thing. But if we go to much more modern societies here, they are much more interested in both thinking about a future as being open. And here I'm drawing on the work of Barbara Adam, who's really been the pioneering person who's been doing work in this area. Time and Society, for example, is a journal that she helped establish, and you'll find lots of work around the future. Another journal called Futures is one that you might want to take a look at. But now what happens with modernity is both the rise of statistics, modes of governing, efforts to colonize the future, to govern the future, to bring into the present moment a preferred future. So this is prefiguring the future in ways in which these preferred futures then become a possible present. And here in the paper, I also reflect on Arjuna Padurai's distinction between possible and probable futures. So possible futures being much more open, probable futures being much more determined by probabilistic statistics and so on. And this is essentially what the OECD is doing when it's using, probability and statistics and indicators and so on in order to govern. And we can remind ourselves that we actually live in a world of, probabilistic kinds of statistics. If you think of all the global rankings that are taking place, what they're all doing is trying to orient you to a future that looks like these rankings of various kinds, best cities, best universities, best schools, and so on. So there's an engine in there. Epsilon and Saunders talk about that as an engine of anxiety, but that future is presented to us as something that we have to both engage with and change our behavior in relation to that future. So Adams basically says, if we were to compare the past with the future, that past and non-modern societies, if we want to put it that way, had a predetermined or predestined future, whereas now this is an abstract, empty and quantifiable space available for unrestricted use and exploitation. And it's this that the international organizations have tried to engage with and exploit. It's not reducible to them, but certainly it's something that they're interested in. There's a couple of different modes of temporality, and just to kind of say this, think of COVID, that moment by moment anticipation. Do you remember when we were all told we had to, stand behind people for, 2 meters? So our movements through time, if we want to think of it that way, are part of our socialization process in ways in which we don't even think too much about how we move through space-time. There are kind of temporal landscapes and cultural codes around these movements. But it's this much more into the future, a temporal landscape that's kind of managed largely through sequencing, calendars of events, etc. And again, think of COVID and the way in which all of that managing of time future was dramatically upset when we can't we can't predict the future because no one was kind of that clued up as to what was actually going on with COVID. It's a very good example. And some people have been writing a bit on anticipation in that regard. So let me just now look at the paper and the arguments. So the key question then for the paper is, how does the OECD and UNESCO use anticipation and strategies and devices? The question for me is, are some anticipatory strategies and devices more powerful? And would it go some way to explaining why it is that UNESCO appears to be less powerful than the OECD? And my argument, I think, in the paper is that it's because UNESCO more or less put on the table a values-based philosophy of the future. And the OECD took significant advice from particularly the United States when it was established, and got going a much more economistic, probabilistic, statistically driven set of kind of future making strategies coming out of through the 60s essentially, and then onward. And in fact, actually, probably until recently, I'd say it was almost not fallible. It was very difficult to see how the OECD wouldn't just keep on expanding and expanding and expanding its governing tools. But I will argue at the end that, in fact, actually, it would appear, particularly for the OECD, that there are some significant legitimation shortfalls, in part because of the way in which it had tied the future to all boats rising to do with neoliberalism. And neoliberalism has arrived and delivered, greater inequalities rather than reduced inequalities and so on. So the argument then is that their different histories, their missions, their resources, and importantly, their geopolitical alliances make these two institutions rather different kinds of institutions. The UNESCO is struggling always from the very beginning because it's going to be an ideas and philosophy-based institution. It will have member states from all over the world. Its mission is then that specific mission to do with culture, which is always going to be contested in ways in which the OECD has been able to put values behind, tuck them behind, make them invisible, statistics and indicators and so on. And it's not that they're not there, but they're not there in the way in which UNESCO has had to wear them. Their different missions, one culture, one economy, mean that they have different kinds of kind of politics that surround them. And I make the distinction, let me just say something about geopolitical alliances. The UNESCO constantly was faced with money being withdrawn, policing for UNESCO, particularly through the 1950s, and McCarthyism, the general view for UNESCO. CIA was often policing any of the conferences and so on, because the United States thought that this was a kind of potential bastion of communism and socialism. And so it's always been faced with money issues, with legitimation issues, and with the sense that ideas could and should be contested, and a much more pluralistic kind of institution as opposed to the OECD, which is member state, rich country club, even though they've got a much bigger ambit of countries, or they're not member states, but they're countries that participate in the various of the data collection exercises for the OECD, PISA, TALIS, PISA for development, and so on. The distinction I make, though, too, between the two institutions is that UNESCO adopted a philosophy of the future. They were hugely influenced initially by some work that came out of the Council of Engagement with World Citizenship that Julian Huxley was the secretary to, and he became the first Director General of. But also in the very early days for UNESCO, it nevertheless did take a dim view of some of the newly countries kind of claiming nationhood, essentially coming out of the Second World War. And there was a kind of very strong whiff of racism there. But several other things that were really important to UNESCO's mandate, essentially, which I will just kind of go on to here, which is, and I'll just move it. So I'm going to go three kind of iterations, one the post-war period, the second the 1970s, and the third one coming out of the 2008 financial crisis. So the first one here is UNESCO had a very strong belief, and it was evolutionary at this moment, okay? And it took the view, and this is Huxley and others, that the societies were on an evolutionary path to some kind of world society, a form of global citizenship, cosmopolitan citizenship in some way. So it's a strong belief in evolution, and that the other, let's say, less developed countries, or so-called pre-modern countries, and I'm using those in quotes, would be on a path toward some kind of evolved state as cosmopolitan, as a world citizen. So that's the first thing. The second is, and this comes directly out of the Second World War, that if you could draw the scientific community into some kind of set of account, being held to account as a transnational society, that you could hold science to account. And they would point to the dropping of the bomb on Japan, that in fact actually the scientists and nationalism and science don't go together. And again, they would be thinking of the genocide that took place in Germany. And so actually an international organization that had science added to, because it was initially UNESCO, not UNESCO, science was added in, and a very strong push. And then a third element, this idea of scientific internationalism. And this actually came out of the League of Nations, which was formed midway through the First World War. And the idea here for UNESCO was that if you bought and all your top scientists, and here I'm thinking of Einstein, Marie Curie, Montessori, all of those scientists, if you brought them together, and they moved in and out of Paris constantly. And this was a global community. Glenda Sluger, who is a wonderful historian of this particular period of international relations, describes multiple, Japan, China, India, and so on, were all involved in the League of Nations. And there's elements of the League of Nations kind of community, this idea, the ideas. So if you go on and have a look at the International Commission on the Futures, you'll find that there's the ideas kind of laboratory element of it there, where you're bringing your international scientists constantly in. Have a look also at the scientific committee that guided the International Commission on the Futures of education for UNESCO, and you'll see, many different scientists from and public intellectuals from all over the world that are on that scientific committee, that included people like Arjuna Padurai, the Morozov, who's the major kind of writer on technology and so on. So that was its telos, and Huxley often thought about, but also so did people like Richard Hoggett, who was looking after the culture element in UNESCO, of it made it a unique organisation, but it made it a deeply problematic organisation. And this is Hoggett to quote, the United Nations system as a whole does not get a good press nowadays, he says. UNESCO, more than any other agency, is likely, if it receives any attention at all, to be treated with amused scorn. This is inevitable because it's preeminently an agency with intellectual and ethical aims that has made it, even when it is performing it well, a sitting target, because there'll be different understandings of ethics and policing of ethics, and cultures must be pluralized, because we actually know that societies, civilizations around the world will have different kinds of social ontologies. But if we go to the OECD, its telos was shaped very much out of modernization theory, coming out of the United States, and specifically out of places like Harvard. Those epistemic experts were absolutely key, and have continued and over time to be key in formulating newer kinds of developments. The global competences, for example, you'll have Reimers providing from Harvard the concept note, Howard Gardner, again from Harvard in the most recent iterations, providing advice and so on around emotions, and that's part of the contemporary OECD kind of reshaping of itself. But it deployed a science of the future, which it required training of experts in statistics. And there were 4 steps here, and you'll recognise this very much as part of the manpower planning, a present analysis, a future estimation, so this is more scenarios going into the future, implementation programs and finance models. And that was pretty much those very early years of the OECD, which morphed out of a different kind of institution that was focused on rebuilding post-war Europe. It opened out, it expanded and included Canada and the United States, and the US was a major funder of the OECD. Its kind of program ontology, if we want to use that kind of term, comes out of the national the Science Academy, the National Academy for Sciences, and assessment and evaluation in the United States. And it was in part the way in which the United States, and particularly in the Sputnik race, where national funding went in the direction of states, and then the national level had to figure out how to get state level programming to account for itself, and they take this kind of national accounting with indicators and statistics. It was that they'd cut their teeth on at the federal level in the United States across into the formation of the OECD. So let us just go forward into, so it's kind of established 50s and 60s, UNESCO's running some data collection, but nations are collecting that data. It's often quite problematic data. It was all input data, but that didn't matter because essentially it wasn't a world where outputs rather than inputs were regarded as fundamental. We get to the, nevertheless, the 1970s and the oil shocks, major changes taking place across many nation states. Keynesianism is kind of on the way out, and there's an attempt to broker in a different kind of future, really. And the international agencies particularly, and particularly the OECD, are kind of called to undertake that work. The OECD was, for example, the secretary to the Trilateral Commission, that's again brokering in neoliberalism. And here what you'll find in the Delors report, the report in 1996, is thinking too about the complete man versus the education for competition. So UNESCO basically, and look at this all-out economic growth. Can you recognize the degrowth agenda here? Can no longer be viewed as the ideal way of reconciling material progress with equity, respect for the human condition, and respect. So UNESCO's really incredibly ahead of its time. You know, we could see this written now in relation to climate change, but this is actually a report that's being written in the mid-1990s. And there's been a strong kind of element in UNESCO of then thinking about issues of sustainability, cultures of sustainability, and so on. If we go across to the OECD, it begins to launch its and ramp up its use of statistics. But UNESCO dominated the statistics collection agenda. And what the OECD is wanting to do is to move in and become the preeminent organization, and both with US-based funding and French funding, but also an effort at making UNESCO look deeply problematic in terms of the statistics that were actually collected, resulted in the OECD being able to ramp up and become the premier institution in the indicator statistics kind of business, you know, which again is trying to prefigure the future, and here then also advance the idea of a knowledge economy. UNESCO itself at this time has on the table the idea of a knowledge society. But if anyone follows the kind of the history of what's going on in terms of economy and society, you'll see that in fact actually it's UNESCO that wins out. So let me just go to the final version, and maybe we can pick up some of these. The latest coming out of the 2008 financial crisis. Already the OECD was aware that there was growing inequalities. We see the Sustainable Development Agenda emerge as well. The idea of global citizenship, And UNESCO, to some extent, is kind of a slightly reinvigorated institution, but it's lost. It does collect and present statistics, but at the same time, it never has enough budget to do that particularly well. There's a part of UNESCO that's doing the global monitoring report, but for example, if you looked at the global citizenship, which is the 4.7, UNESCO is never going to have the resource on the table, and even indeed the kind of expertise that the OECD has built up. And here what we see now is the OECD now putting the feelers out to become the data collection kind of agency for 4.7 global citizenship, which again speaks quite directly to the interests of this network. But what you'll notice also is that the OECD itself, as the global competitive agenda that the PISA and TALIS and others have had at their heart, has kind of slipped off the agenda. And what we've got with the OECD is this learning compass. And let me just point out the way in which, for instance, anticipation is fundamental. So this is about an individual child with agency. So this is, this is nominated by the OECD on its global compass. And now it's well-being here that's prioritized as being something that is crucially important. But anyone that reads on this area around the rise of emotions, happiness, grit, resilience, and so on, would actually recognize that this kind of sits well inside the neoliberal agenda. It's kind of the antidote to the problems that neoliberalism, to a large extent, excessive competition, individualism, undermines the conditions for solidarity, concentrations of wealth. On the other hand, the OECD itself, a little bit of the OECD, of UNESCO, Raoul Miller, who had a history of being at the OECD, has also taken up a kind of a role within UNESCO, advancing the idea of transforming the future using or trying to develop the idea of anticipation as a discipline. And thinking about anticipation, if it's a discipline, again, what might be the basis of those kinds of claims? So let me just summarize, and then I'll try and draw it to a close. So the first moment, we get this a little bit of attention. One's an unfolding future, but there's also an attempt initially to also prefigure that future, how to bring a future in that is non-socialist on the part of the OECD, but also to some extent UNESCO, and how to do it on the one hand for UNESCO using a philosophical approach, certain values and so on, versus technical instruments that we see with the OECD. We see, secondly, as we move into the 70s, 80s and 90s, a much more open and contingent future mediated by missions. There's a moment in the 90s and a struggle over statistics, but then we see the rise of the OECD as the hegemon. Then from 2008, I would want to argue, when the OECD is confronted with the limits of neoliberalism, competitive individualism, pathologies around anxiety and so on, that it's actually had to change course and try and think about a different kind of anticipatory device that it rolls out there in order to try to develop a particular kind of future kind of in there. So let me just go to my final slide, and then I'll just open it up. In conclusion, I do argue that their histories, mandates and modes of internal governance matter. Their strategic alignments, geostrategic alignments matter. OECD has benefited hugely from investment from the United States, and the fact that geopolitically the United States is a very powerful nation. And it'll be very interesting to think about what goes on as we see the rise of China and how that kind of plays itself out. I argue in that paper particularly, and I think that's the knowledge, added value on the table, a philosophy of the future, makes explicit the values. And more recently, when the OECD has gone into thinking about global competences and culture, it's pulled back out of that very rapidly, because you can see that in fact actually cultures are then kind of contested. So I'm just going to finish it there and open out the space for questions.
Thank you, Susan. This is very inspiring presentation. I personally would be very interested in knowing more from your perspective on how do you include in this perspective of different anticipatory strategies and a different philosophy versus sciences of the future. How do you include this, a more critical approach on the future based on the pedagogy of hope by Paulo Freire? Because I know that you know very well Paulo Freire. You are now editing a special issue on globalization, society, and education on Global Freire. So Freire has also strongly supported the role of future in terms of creating the future through the perspective of hope, in terms of a way for overcoming fatalism, resignation, there is no alternative approaches, etc., etc. So I'm wondering if there's a space within this menu of different strategies of and imagining the future of the critical approach from Freire.
So let me just reflect on a couple of things then. The Freire issue, where Massimiliano's a part of that, and thinking about these moments of crisis. And again, that was something that all of you mentioned in some way. I mean, what I think I've tried to do in the paper is look at these moments that Anne Mische talks about of, efforts of hyper-projectivity is what she says, where the future is to play for. And then there's a kind of settling down and a stabilizing and a rolling out and that kind of thing. And I'd probably say for the moment, I don't think the OECD has got it right. It's still casting around, as is UNESCO. It's got a lot in that report on things like compassion and so on. But got a PhD student currently who's looking at the cognitive science parsing of compassion. And again, for all of us that are kind of thinking about what's being governed and how it's being governed, and we should notice, for example, the rise of cognitive science, which sits nicely at one level, doesn't it, with a certain kind of way of thinking about behavioral economics, with cognitive science and competences, that kind of thing. And my sense is that we would need to go to a Freirean kind of understanding of the future, where the affect and emotions and some different elements are kind of in there that enable us to think very differently about what kind of future that we might actually want. And so I think there's some very fertile space in there for some ongoing work. And again, I can see, is it Chow? Sorry for mispronouncing your name, but I'd love to see your thesis, for example, as you get that underway.
Thanks very much, Susan. Thank you also for this final comment. I'm particularly happy to give the floor to Doug Bourne, the president, the chair of Angel. Doug just wrote a couple of articles on the pedagogy of hope, exactly on this topic, and we are co-edited a book by Bloomsbury on pedagogy of hope, collecting several papers from previous Angel events and international events.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Susan. Just a couple of things in terms of conclusion, because I think for a network like Angel, which is quite a new network, one of the big issues we continue to face is that as our agendas become more popular and almost taken up in a number of ways by international organizations, like 10 years ago, terms like global citizenship were not on the agenda of international organizations in the way they are now. So, and I think the ways in which international organizations are now using some of the terminology that's been part of our field for 15, 20 years is, I think, very interesting. And how we respond to that is, I think, one of the challenges we have going forward. And that's why we've consciously arranged this conference in partnership with UNESCO in a couple of weeks' time, particularly with that in mind, how we can bring those things together. But going on to what Massimiliano has just been saying, yeah, so I the last 2 or 3 years, I've found that as a result of the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic, the whole question about sense of optimism and a sense of thinking about the future has become important. So to me, the sense how we bring those conversations into that sense of positivity is, I think, important. In my area of work, often issues get concerned. People talk about eco-anxiety. I say want to turn that into a sense of anger and sense of change. So to me, the sense of how we promote that sense of optimism and moving forward is important. Because to me, educationists have to be optimistic and have to be forward thinking. Otherwise, we're not good educationists. And that to me brings me back to what Susan has said. And I think those things are therefore very important in terms of when we go forward, that need to bear those things in mind. So for those of us who are engaged in the Angel Network, the issues that you've raised, Susan, are very relevant in that context, because that means that the need to be mindful of what's happening in terms of the international organizations and how we relate to that is, I think, very important in terms of going forward. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And actually, to say that the paper did circulate through UNESCO, apparently they've told me. So I'd be very interested to talk to them to see what they made of it.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I'll see you next year for this webinar series in November. But the full program will be available before the summer, hopefully. So thank you again, and I'll see you soon.